Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Live from Brussels, the podcast that brings you the latest insights on pressing issues facing Europe and the world. I am your co-host, João Maria Botelho, and I'm joined here in the studio by my esteemed host, Professor Lucila. How are you today, Professor Lucila?
I'm doing great, João. It's a pleasure to be here with you, delving into the topics that matter. Today we have an episode that shines a light on an important subject, the just transition. We will be exploring how this mechanism is transforming our economies and ensure a fair and sustainable future.
Absolutely. The Just Transition Mechanism, announced in December 2029, is a groundbreaking initiative that allocates 55 billion euros to support workers and communities most affected by the transition to a green economy. And today, we will have two esteemed guests who will provide us with valuable insights on this topic.
Our first guest is Mathilde Wordsworth, the Deputy Director General at DG Energy. With her extensive experience and expertise, Mathilde will share with us the achievement of the Just Transition mechanisms in creating new green jobs and supporting coal-reliant regions.
And joining us as our second guest is Judith Keaton-Darling, the Deputy General Secretary of Industrial European Trade Union. Judith will provide us with an overview of how the Just Transition mechanism is being implemented across different European member states and discuss the additional measures being taken to protect workers, communities, amidst the evolving complexities of the world.
We are honored to have such knowledgeable and influential voices join us today. Through our discussion with Mathilde Wordsworth and Judith Keaton-Darling, we aim to gain a deeper insights into the progress made and the challenge faces in ensuring a just transition towards a greener and more sustainable future.
So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, as we delve into the fascinating world of the just transition and explore the pathways towards a fair and prosperous future for all.
So, as you said, this was announced in 2019 and we implemented in 2020. So it's a bit early to look at the result, but what we already know that it's extremely important to get all regions on board. And this one is on just transition. So it's mainly coal-based or regions which have to transition and want to transition. So what we asked these regions to come up with plans, how to do it, what is the impact on skills and workers? And we got a lot of return, which we are now assessing, and then we will see results in the coming years. But we already know that on the energy side, there is a lot of reskilling or people who were trained as in the coal area, coal miners and others, who are now retrained in order to work on renewables, wind, onshore, solar, and so on. So we start to see the results, but it's a bit too early to quantify it. But the mobilization of the regions, the eagerness to really show that they are part of the clean energy transition, even if they still have coal, but they are ready to step up. And that, I think, was the intention. And I'm quite happy that in those countries who have still coal, this is really a movement which has been going forward very well.
In some ways, our core demands as industrial Europe are more relevant and pertinent today in the context of that very complex situation in the energy sector and the knock-on impact of the war in Ukraine and energy price crisis for heavy industry in particular. And that is that when the Green Deal was produced at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, we argued from that point that Europe needed a strong industrial policy accompanying our climate policy. Just having climate targets and having a market-driven approach, we recognised as industrial trade unions wasn't going to deliver the energy transition in a fair way, neither for the energy sector itself, nor for the sectors which depend on the energy transition and the electrification of society. So we've been demanding now for several years for a really strong industrial policy response. And for a long time, we haven't seen it. We haven't seen industrial policy as a topic which was high on the political programme of the European Union. And the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, in combination with the Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS Act, has radically shifted the debate in Europe. And that is really welcome from our perspective, that finally there's a recognition in Europe that you have to have an industrial policy agenda to accompany the radical energy transition that we're on, if we want to ensure a just transition, because we have 25 million manufacturing workers in Europe and energy sector workers who are dependent on the jobs linked to these industries. So without a fair transition of these industries, there are lots of jobs and livelihoods which are at stake. So now we're analysing what the Commission has put on the table in response to the US Inflation Reduction Act. From our perspective, unfortunately, it's old wine in pretty old bottles. There are a number of initiatives which were already on the table, were already foreseen. The amount of money that we're talking about is largely existing pots of money, rebranded in order to address this industrial policy strategy. And we see a fallback on state aid rules, which for us raises really fundamental questions about the future of European integration, because if our industrial policy is based on those with the deepest pockets being able to support their industries and support the energy transition, then and those with weaker national finances unable to support, then we won't see a just transition in Europe. And lots of the efforts which have been put in place through the Just Transition Fund, through the territorial Just Transition plans, will really be undermined by the lack of a true European industrial strategy. So what we need today is a European approach and a European level strategy in response to what's happening elsewhere in the world, in the US, in China, and elsewhere, rather than country by country, dependent on national pots of money. And at every stage, workers and communities who are impacted by the transitions should be really at the forefront of policy making. This has to be an inclusive process, otherwise we really risk that there's a backlash to the transition that is underway, and that backlash will be terrible for the workers and the communities impacted, terrible for our economy long term, because we will see a decline in innovation, in industrial power in Europe, and ultimately terrible for the environment and for our climate objectives. So there's a lot at stake. We need to get this right, but with the Inflation Reduction Act, in our view, Europe has an opportunity to up its game. We put the Green Deal on the global table. The US have put the Inflation Reduction Act on the table, bringing US climate action into place for the first time ever. And now what we need is Europe to up its game and recognise that the old recipes won't deliver the change that we need and guarantee a just transition.
I think last year, the energy crisis following the invasion of Russia to Ukraine has been unprecedented. So it was a big concern on security of supply, reduce the dependence from Russian gas, diversify, but also invest a lot in energy efficiency and renewables. So I think it triggered a lot of emergency measures. We saw a lot of solidarity between the EU member states to help each other. But on the downside, we also saw energy prices were skyrocketing, certainly in August. And since then, they have calmed down a little bit, but still on a high level. So we have been working on demand side measures with member states. So 20% less gas demand last year than the previous year. And industry was part of it to save energy, but also save money. And we have been working on the supply side. When it comes to the reaction to IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, I think, first of all, we welcome that the US is part of the game on the clean tech. The focus is right. We all have to move to combat climate change, do more for renewables, all clean technologies. When I remember that the US was going out of the Paris Treaty after 2015, it's a good step. Now, what we did, the Commission, and it was well received from the European member states, is really to look at the competitiveness of our energy, not only to have high ambition on renewables, but have it produced within the EU and look at our industrial competitiveness. So as the energy prices are at a still high but much lower level than the peak last year, I think that already helps what we did there. And now we are looking really how to help, partly with subsidies, but we don't want too much competition on the subsidies, but also with the right framework, with the right financial support. And I think Europe has very good qualities, and we see many EU countries, Portugal, others stepping up on onshore wind, on solar, and they have their own resources. So I think EU is maybe a bit more complex, but at the end of the day, I think with our industry policy, which we launched a few days ago and followed up, but with some concrete measures, which we are planning right now for March, I think we are in a good position to catch up and also keep the competitiveness in our industry here in Europe.
So over the last few years, since mid-2020, when the Just Transition Fund was created, all of the member states have been developing what are called territorial just transition plans. These are regional plans which come together in a national consortium of plans dealing with the coal regions and carbon-intensive regions in each member state. And those plans have taken shape in different ways in different countries, and the proportion of money which is allocated to each country is different. So we've seen some of those plans developed in Estonia, for example, dealing with the oil shale phase out, or in northern Sweden, where it's dealt with the decarbonisation of the steel industry and transformation of heavy industry. And then we see some of the really big countries, the big coal heavy countries like Poland, Romania, where those plans and the process of developing an alternative agenda for coal regions has really meant a radically different approach to economic policy making at regional level. All of those plans were submitted, except with the exception of Bulgaria, by the end of last year. They've been accepted by the Commission, and now we're in the process of trying to ensure that we as workers, as trade unions, are actively engaged in the implementation of those plans, so that the money which is allocated to the regions through the Just Transition Fund really finds its way to the workers who are directly affected by the transition.